Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Inter-American Dialogue. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. In 2005, Venezuela's President Hugo Chavez launched a program that he promised would strengthen institutions and empower populations in Venezuela's neighboring countries and islands. It was called Petrocaribe. It was a sprawling program that supplied 14 beneficiary countries with over 346 million barrels of oil over the course of a decade, the equivalent of $28 billion. Although Petrocaribe was supposed to be a path to social and economic growth in Central America and the Caribbean, it ended up being a means to consolidate regional allies against what he saw as a growing U.S. imperialist threat, and protect Chavez and later Maduro from international critiques of Venezuela's democratic decay and worsening human rights record. Venezuela's oil dividends and petro diplomacy allowed, and still allows, the corrupt Maduro regime to deflect international scrutiny despite overseeing one of the most acute humanitarian crises in the history of this hemisphere and the most dramatic migrant exodus in that history. The fraud and coercion exercised under the banner of Petrocaribe forms one important part of this system of corrupt regional influence. We are very pleased this morning to have with us the journalistic team that exposed the extent of Petrocaribe corruption throughout the region. Carlos Eduardo Huertas, the founder and executive director of Conectas, will present the conclusions of Petrofraude, a comprehensive report on corruption and influence peddling in the Petrocaribe program, which Conectas researched and wrote in collaboration with 4 other Latin American media outlets. We will use Carlos's presentation of the Petrofraude report as a departure point for today's discussion on buying votes and lining pockets, Venezuela's petro diplomacy. We are very pleased to partner with Conectas and also the International Center for Journalists, the National Endowment for Democracy, and Transparency International on this event. I also want to thank and acknowledge Michael Camilleri, my colleague, who is the director of the Dialogue's Rule of Law program, who together with my colleague Tamar Ziff have helped coordinate and manage this program. Before giving the floor to Carlos for his opening comments, let me also just let everybody know that we'll be going back and forth from Spanish to English during the session, and that we have translation available, and if anybody needs headsets, please feel free to go and get them. So again, thank you all very, very much for coming, and I'm delighted to give the floor now to my friend Carlos. Carlos.
Muchas gracias al Diálogo Interamericano por.
I thank the International Dialogue for receiving us this morning. I thank ICFJ, a partner with whom we've worked for a number of years in Latin America, the National Endowment for Democracy, that's also given us much support in a number of journalistic projects we've carried out in the region. Transparency International, that's also played an important role in surveillance of transparency in the region. So to break the ice, and for starters, I would like to ask, who's ever been in love before? Raise your hands. Well, I see a lot of hard-hearted people this morning. Don't worry, the camera isn't filming you. This is the time to do it. So this story started like many other love stories. The passion that journalists feel for some stories that we never get around to finishing, and we persevere, and we stick to it until finally we can conclude our project. Now this project that we have, the ICFJ, International Center for Journalists, we started this in El Salvador We were looking into how large sums of money were being invested in that country irregularly as part of this program. We usually share this type of story with other media outlets for a greater impact. And when we did this, almost all of the media outlets turned this publication away. They said these figures have to be wrong. They're too large. They just don't coincide, don't match Latin American reality. But we certainly acknowledge there were some voids that we had to fill to complete the story. And so those colleagues who rejected this story, they were the ones who were wrong. Because it wasn't the figures we thought, those figures were actually much larger. And we call this petro fraud. So the Chavista regime, going back to 2005, and now the Maduro regime, they created this energy program and of cooperation for the purpose of collaborating with the countries of the Caribbean, mostly. But this program, which ended up investing $28 billion in 14 countries, became ultimately a currency with which to buy diplomatic support, which has enabled Venezuela to weather different situations that we all know about in Venezuela without any type of inter-American checks and balances disrupting the normal activities of such systems such as the inter-American system. Now, local political groups benefited from this, and they ultimately replicated similar systems. Nicaragua being a case in point, Haiti, another dramatic situation, and El Salvador, if you look at the political evolution that has happened there. Now, just to give you an idea of how large this is, we've heard of the Brazilian Odebrecht scandal, which ended up in the Department of Justice. We're talking about $1 billion in payments of bribes, and with benefits not surpassing 13 or 2 to 3 billion rather. And we're talking about $28 billion in the case of Venezuela in a decade, and we don't have an exact idea of how much that was. Much of it has been spent, but just to give you an idea of how large this is. Now, Connectus headed up this effort and used a methodology that has been replicated in different examples, the Panama Papers being emblematic. Had it not been for the collaboration and transnational, international support, a consortium of research or investigative journalists helped us out and made this possible. And we have many partners, allies in Latin America, Confidential in Nicaragua, Pitazo in Venezuela. The DR also has another ally of ours, as well as Graphic Press, Prensa Gráfica in El Salvador, and also Fabiola Torres, who is a part of the ICFJ project, has helped us in putting together the final project. And at the end of the day, a dozen or so journalists, developers, graphic designers came together to help tell this story. What this shows, in essence, is how a whole architecture was erected that made it possible from a military outlook to build something from the outset that is a ring of protection around the power structure in Venezuela, as the Chavistas called it. Now you can go to Connectus website. You can go to our website and find that information. So this ring of power shows how more than 300 million barrels of oil received by a number of countries to set up this ring of protection, diplomatic protection from the region. This mechanism started with some low interest loans. I'm talking about 2% interest, ridiculously low, amortized over a long period, and that ultimately became a mechanism for the exchange of oil for food and allowing for different types of corruption. Now, the countries that benefited from this, they received huge sums of money in places that are very geographically small and with small populations. Now that gave rise to concern about the result of any transition in the political regime in Venezuela and what that might mean for these countries. And so this is a struggle that continues around the oil, and ultimately it holds out some dramatic consequences for these countries. Now, through the research that we did, more than 800 documents we looked into to see exactly what the extent of this support was at the OAS, for example. And in the image here on the screen, you can see all of the countries that benefited from the petro fraud scheme over the course of this whole system. And these countries ultimately lent their diplomatic support to Venezuela in exchange for the oil they received. Now, a dramatic result is the very situation that we have in Venezuela right now, known well to all. This is something that we have seen in depth: shortages of supplies, people don't have access to food. It's a wealthy country that exported its wealth, creating abject poverty domestically. And those countries that benefited, Haiti being a dramatic case after the earthquake in 2010, hundreds of thousands of dead, received more than $2.1 billion to rebuild. So we were able to document that with our team on the ground using drones and other technologies, and we could see the status of these projects. Some, like the one you see on the screen, this is a finished project that's not being used, right next to some shanty towns, slums, themselves in a very critical situation. Paradoxically, we see the parliament itself. We see reports of high levels of optimal performance, but in reality, it's not doing anything. Hospitals, huge projects that have been abandoned, other types of operations, such as shopping centers or markets for fish markets and other types of markets abandoned. Haitian citizens have taken to the streets, calling for transparency. That was the main variable that was absent in these programs. Venezuelan authorities, meanwhile, reported how the program was being carried out according to the standards they called for correctly. But the fact is, the result was more poverty in the countries that benefited from this largesse. So this is what we've done in our research is reveal this information as money comes in and goes out. Working with civil society organizations and other journalists, we arrived at some of the best data about these projects. It's not all of the available data. That's a disclaimer I need to make. These are very complex contexts in which there's a lack of information. It's hard to get information in Venezuela, Nicaragua, and some of these other countries. It's really hard to come by this information, but more than 400 different social projects, public works projects we looked into. We could document what the current status of them is, and we were able to document and chronicle situations in which you could see egregious cases of corruption, such as in El Salvador. As you see on the screen, an example of this: land or lots bought for $85,000 and 3 months later sold for $2 million to justify losses in their financial books. This just by way of introduction to kick off the panel, moderated by Luis Botello, and also from the Dialogue. And so I thank you, Michael Camilleri from the Dialogue, Transparency International, the Petro Fraude team from Conecas, a journalist from Diario Libre, Maria Gonzalez, David Gonzalez rather, from Conectas, Cecilia Romero in El Salvador work together on this. And so follow us on our network, or social network. We've made a real effort to ensure that this can be viewed on your smartphones. You can visit us in English or Spanish on Twitter. You can find us Facebook/Conectas, for example.
Excelente. Gracias, Carlos. Thank you very much for your partnership and for presenting the conclusions of what is a really extraordinary, I think, feat of investigative journalism, a very comprehensive and complete report, which I certainly commend to your reading. I think many of us sort of suspected a lot of the fraud and corruption and diplomatic sort of influence peddling that the report presents, but it's different to see it documented in such detail in black and white. And so, again, just recommend that everybody take a look at the report. The findings of the report also, I think, take on, and Carlos mentioned this, added kind of salience in the current context. We're seeing
We are going to break away from this discussion on Venezuela briefly to fulfill our commitment to bring you live coverage of the U.S. Senate. We'll return momentarily. The Senate about to gavel in for a short pro forma session with no vote scheduled. And now live to the floor of the U.S. Senate.
The Senate will come to order. The clerk will read a communication to the Senate.
Washington, D.C., March 19, 2019. To the Senate, under the provisions of Rule 1, Paragraph 3 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, I hereby appoint the Honorable Ben Sass, a senator from the state of Nebraska, to perform the duties of the chair. Signed, Chuck Grassley, President pro tempore.
Under the previous order, the Senate stands adjourned until 2:10 p.m. on Thursday, March 21st, 2019.
Wrapping up this brief Senate pro forma session, lawmakers will be back next week for more work on judicial nominations. We are also expecting a vote on the House Democrats' Green New Deal. And now back to live discussion on alleged corruption in Venezuela.
I'm grateful for all the sponsors and Conectas, obviously Dialogue as well, that's hosting us here. As Michael said, we're going to try to use both languages, so I'll be switching to Spanish so we can help also with our panelists to understand some of the questions. Yo quiero empezar con
I would like to begin with David, who was the lead coordinator, especially because of the data that was gathered that was very significant. In addition to the news findings, David, in your opinion, what were the key contributions that came to light as a result of this investigation? I have worked in several years in investigative journalism, and you have as well in the region, and this is kind of unprecedented. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to address you today and share the findings of our investigation which I think is an amazing opportunity to also talk about Venezuela and what we came to know about how the state has handled its business over the past few years. I believe that just to provide you some background, what makes this work valuable is that it is unprecedented. That is to say, efforts had been made in the past to tell isolated stories about some of those countries, but our work shows a comprehensive picture, and I believe that that is key to understand the scope and the depth of the work that we did. Petrocaribe covered 14 countries, so it became like a transnational jigsaw puzzle. So we had to do a comprehensive work to show how it worked. So that in and of itself is a huge effort, which is something that investigative journalism had not been able to do up to that point in the region. So that's one of the first things that we need to bear in mind. Also, Carlos gave us some very interesting findings, but I believe that we need to begin from a statement that I believe can summarize our work, and that is the injection of millions of dollars worth of resources that are implemented with very few checks and balances, and that enables political influence as a result of mechanisms that are not scrutinized and that leave the door open to corruption. So, following this modus operandi, we can see how this compensation system, it's called trade exchange, was set in place through which some of the countries could pay back part of the debt that they acquired through PDVSA through long-term loans, and they were bartering products. That is to say, Venezuela would get food in exchange for oil, because its population was having a very hard time accessing food. This was supposed to be a regional model to foster fair trade, etc. But very low quality products were sent to Venezuela. They were overvalued, and corruption networks flourished around the food business, food which is a basic need of all people. Then we carefully reviewed what was happening in several of our member countries, and we can see what the checks and balances agencies, the courts of account, for example, at the local level, to see how they had been overseeing implementation of resources, and rarely had we seen any kind of comment or remark on the way things were being done. It was totally obscure. And this is an unfinished business in many of the beneficiary countries. That is to say, go into the details of how these resources were executed. Then, Suhelis will talk about this, but aid to Haiti is a totally unprecedented chapter in history. And then we have to see how all this articulates or comes into play with Venezuela's diplomatic relations. We were able to rebuild or put in black and white through these 800 documents what had happened, and also come up with a timeline of what high-level Venezuelan officials were saying, as well as what high-level officials from beneficiary countries were saying. For example, Ministry of Petroleum in Venezuela, who said that the intention Venezuela had was to have this model implemented in Latin America in order to show dominance in the region. But we also reviewed the OAS documents, which we used to populate a database, and that gave us a regional landscape, which is something that had never been done before. Thank you, David. You mentioned Haiti. Suhelis, we saw some of the images that Carlos showed, which are shocking to say the least. Haiti is the poorest country in the hemisphere, which was on top of everything shaken by an earthquake in January 2010 that killed millions of people and left hundreds of thousands of people homeless. And Petrocaribe, in theory, was going to help with the rebuilding process. But what happened? What did you find out about that money? The relationship between Venezuela and Haiti through Petrocaribe was special because of the earthquake. Starting in 2010, Venezuela started offering cooperation in a different way from what Petrocaribe had been using in the rest of the region, because it was focused on rebuilding efforts after the earthquake. So emergency laws were passed in Haiti in order to award contracts, and these contracts did not meet the requirements. So some companies were awarded contracts and were companies that were legally non-existent. That happened with some of the reconstruction or rebuilding contracts. Some other companies had not been in business long enough to qualify for these rebuilding contracts in Haiti, but in general, over $2 billion were awarded for rebuilding contracts, and either they were not completed or they were completed, but the population does not know how to use them, and some have not even started, such as the parliament building. Haiti's parliament building 9 years after the earthquake is still operating in a pre-manufactured building that's close to that vacant piece of land that we saw in the picture, which is where the old legislative palace used to sit up until the earthquake in 2010. So we had countless numbers of construction cases. We went to like dozens of construction sites, unfinished hospitals, unfinished markets, the palace, housing complexes. The significance of that cooperation or the aid through Petrocaribe was to address the needs of the people that had been hurt by the earthquake. And we found that some projects never started, and there are still shelters in place that were built by international organizations back in 2010, or international organizations that have long left because the emergency as such has already come to an end. And so the population needs have not been addressed. Now, what did we find out about the contracts? Well, not only poor implementation, but also in many cases, part of the money was in fact disbursed. Let me go back to the Legislative Palace example. $10 million were disbursed, and there's nothing to account for that. There's barely some ground leveling that took place, but that's about it. And the same thing happens in other construction sites. Not only that, but the ones that were concluded that are like sports specs or facilities of that sort, at the end of the day, we're not rebuilding projects per se. Some people remain homeless, but they have like soccer fields. Or the Hugo Chavez Park, that was one of the projects that was actually finished and completed and is pretty close to the airport. So another thing that we found out when we looked at the contracts is that there are companies that benefited through these very lax rules in the award process, and that have ties with Jovenel Moïse, the current president, and some others have ties to former President Michel Martelly, who are for those sportsplex projects, and others with ties to a Dominican official, Felix Bautista, who was already tied to other corruption cases in the region. And those were the main findings. Through the accounting documents from Felix Bautista, we were able to trace the route to other places where the money was sent. The money did not stay in Haiti. This is just one of the many. He received millions of dollars. We were able to rebuild the route and trace it back to his accounts in the Dominican Republic or foundations that are in the Dominican Republic, but were also used to fund Haiti's presidential campaign, with donations to two candidates, Michel Martel himself and Merlin Manigat, and potentially Alejandro Toledo's election campaign. I think we need to talk a lot more about that. That is to say, incidents of politics in the country. So I'm sorry, he's not speaking into the microphone. So Transparency International, for a long time, has been trying to shed light on the major corruption cases all over the world. So how does this investigation compare to other investigations that you've done in the past, and in what way does it illustrate Venezuela's current situation?
Thanks, Luis, and many thanks also to the co-organizers for the invitation to come today. I'm going to do my best to channel Merci, who is the head of our Venezuela chapter. I will not succeed because she is formidable. But in fact, sure. So Transparency International, on the ground, represented by our chapter, has done a tremendous amount of research looking at the way in which large-scale social program investments, large-scale infrastructure investments are basically co-opted for through corruption, for political interests, and really depriving people of the right to health, education, housing, et cetera. They've done a tremendous amount of work even to understand the sort of diplomatic relationships between Venezuela and several other countries. That said, what's for me is so powerful about this study is it really gets at the sort of export of corruption by Venezuela for diplomatic purposes in a way, in black and white, that is sort of a real aha moment for us. For me, as a representative of Transparency International, which has 13 Latin American chapters, several chapters in English-speaking Caribbean, including Guyana, Jamaica, Trinidad and Tobago, and along with several individual representatives from that region, it's clear that we need to be much better organized across borders between our Caribbean civil society and certainly Venezuelan civil society, that the flows of corruption and co-optation that are represented by this study really require really strong concerted transnational civil society cooperation, which is, you know, going to only be seeded by this powerful study. And I also think more generally, this is a very interesting example of what TI and many partners around the world have been looking at, often, you know, focusing more on Russia, the Middle East, of how petrostates, kleptocratic states really export corruption to defend their own interests.
Thank you, Zoe. Miriam, I'll ask the question in English, though you should feel free to respond in whatever language you like. Zoe spoke about the export of corruption, the transnational impact in your home country, especially the really just dramatic humanitarian impacts, and including around the recent blackout that went on for days and had people, you know, searching for food and water desperately in many cases. When you look at this report, what does it tell you? What comes to mind in terms of the impacts, the situation within Venezuela itself?
Bueno, voy a hablar en español.
I'm going to speak in Spanish. Well, thank you very much. And before answering the question, I would like to reiterate that the Latin American team is extremely proud of having contributed and collaborated with this effort, which is pioneering, and it sets the new golden standard for investigative journalism in the region. So please go to Conecta's website and take a look at this effort because it's commendable. So having said this, thank you very much to all the organizers. The issue of humanitarian aid is closely related to what this effort reveals. Very briefly, it's very important to highlight that when Chavez got to power in Venezuela, one of his main objectives was to displace traditional elites and create new elites. I'm talking about economic, political, cultural, religious, military military elites, that is to say, to create a new social and political structure in the country. And one of the means with which he displaced economic elites was to, first of all, and especially starting in 2003, expropriation or nationalization, that is to say, to put an end to key aspects of local production, among other things, for example, the issue of electricity, and you have recently seen the consequences of that hitting the agricultural and industrial sectors specifically. So on the one hand, we have expropriations or nationalizations, which decrease local production capability, which they try to make up for through imports. Imports that are generated through two ways. One, by creating ties with, developing ties with state-run companies all over the world or economic groups with partner countries. And what we in Venezuela know as the Bolivian bourgeoisie. So how does Petrocaribe play into all this? Well, basically through a compensation mechanism through which the countries that are linked to Petrocaribe pay off debts and petroleum subsidies by exporting agricultural and food products to Venezuela. So this is specifically evident in the case of Nicaragua. Nicaragua started exporting to Venezuela products that are traditional to the country, such as cattle, black beans, coffee. That is to say, products that are domestically grown and that are a staple to their country and that are grown in their own country. So in Venezuela, all of these products are regulated that force the producers to sell the product below the production cost. So the producers choose to stop producing because otherwise they do it at a loss. So these two elements come into play. That is to say, on the one hand, impose their domestic production sector impossible production standards that are highly costly and that make no economic sense, or this other expropriation policy. In the case of, for example, other sugar mills, they are importing sugar from other countries, and so they stop producing sugar in the country, and through these imports, this massive export network of all kinds of goods and services appears, which kind of takes over local production. So in the end, when the country no longer has the resources to import products, we run into the current situation. So a domestic production apparatus that does not have the necessary incentives to produce on the one hand, and on the other hand, an ability of the state to import all of the goods and services that used to be produced domestically and that could have been imported in the past because of the high oil levels, but that is no longer the case because of the price. So Petrocaribe is part of this whole thing of giving the country products that were traditionally part of their staple diets, but that as a result of all these very highly corrupted schemes are introduced into the country, and that end up being one of the elements that give way to the current humanitarian crisis. Thank you. Miriam, David, what role does PDVSA play in this whole scheme? Interesting question. Venezuela, like they just said, it's a petro state. That is to say, that's their main staple, their main export, and that is why the elites that are in power depend on these resources. So PDVSA is at the core of this petro-state structure in Venezuela. Now, in the case of a petro fraud investigative case, and This led to unveiling million-dollar corruption cases that have to do with state-run petroleum companies. In the case of petro fraud, we found PDVSA's internal documents revealing that the company branch that should have been overseeing the exchange contract with these countries as part of this contract scheme did not have the checks and balances or the necessary protocols in order to do this without huge deviations. I'm talking about minimal things such as ensuring that, for example, having the export protocols showing what a certain ship dropped off or how many tons of product were sent into the country or what was sent from Nicaragua to pay off a portion of their debt. This basic information that PDVSA did not have. So this investigation clearly reveals with all this documentation that these agreements or contracts did not have internal checks and balances within the company on the commercial transactions that were taking place. I can keep talking about this, but basically it's very hard to conceive how these checks and balances were not in place. Apparently, there was an intent in having this happen in a very messy way, and all this money movement will help the beneficiary countries, which is very clearly seen in the case of Nicaragua, especially because of the compensation, because petroleum is given out with very, very few controls. So this is the central is a central part of this political scheme. It's part of the oil subsidy, but it's completely messy based on the evidence that we were able to acquire. David, I imagine this also has a supporting financial structure, because how can we have these type of transactions and have them go in undetected? I think Transparency International has worked with fiscal havens. We talk about accounts in Panama. So the question is, what role do fiscal havens play in these type of investigations?
It's hard for me to imagine any of this happening without anonymous shell companies. This is the major vehicle that kleptocrats use to get their money out of their own countries because they don't actually trust their own countries to be a stable investment option. And this is absolutely the vehicle that is used to conceal illicit gains. And dirty money flows won't flow if you don't have anonymous shell companies. So that's why it's one of the #1 advocacy issues for Transparency International today. That said, we also need to look at how the money is spent. It's not just about having budget transparency. We really need to look at all the ways in which you can capture, not just money laundering, but in these cases, the investments that sort of go to the corrupt and not to the people. So how do you really monitor and ensure accountability in large-scale public investments in infrastructure? And I could go on for days about the tools we have for that, but I would say that we need a much more concerted effort to really tackle shell companies, and that's why we're excited to see legislation that has bipartisan support to make shell companies at least transparent to law enforcement in the United States. It's step one. It's not the greatest version of that kind of a law, but it's what will make sense here for now. And this is really going to be such a critical pathway going forward.
David, ¿quieres agregar algo?
Is there anything else you would like to add? Just to quickly supplement what my colleagues just said, in the case of El Salvador, during the course of our investigation, we analyzed some real estate transactions where you can clearly see the involvement of companies that receive million loans from the company that's implementing the Petro-Caribbean gains at a local level. In El Salvador, a binational company was created between PDVSA and a partnership of government mayors, and they are the ones who implement the resources. This company that in theory should channel all these social aid and social programs has become a lender to people that they handpick. Part of these loans, for example, in the case of El Salvador, were given to companies that did transactions that, according to the patterns that we identified, were part of a real estate speculative scheme. So those companies that had received loans in turn had other companies that were part of their own network. So they developed this network of real estate companies that want to create money routes in a way that it goes undetected. In Chapter 2, in the case of El Salvador, it is explained in detail, and it's along the lines of what we just said. Just to supplement that, I think it also talks about how these types of fraud end up supporting certain political parties. So I don't know, Suhelis, if you want to add anything else, what you found out in terms of direct support to political parties that have direct influence in the politics of some of the countries. Yes, through the aid that was given to Haiti, we were able to see how the quote-unquote political businessman, a senator from the Dominican Republic, made donations. We understood that it was with business interests, but made donations to the presidential campaign where Michel Martelly and Mirlan Manigat, who's a daughter of a former Haitian politician. But anyways, both had received donations from Felix Bautista. She acknowledged it. She said that she did receive about $500,000, and Michel Martelly is supposed to have received over $1 million for his campaign. But we also saw that in the case of Peru, in the Perú Posible political party where Alejandro Toledo ran for president the last time. And we also saw it in Panama with Martinelli's family members, who, through one of the companies that had contracts in Haiti, with also a company that also belongs to a Dominican politician that received money there. So, as far that this is the part of the La Española island interest. In the case of Nicaragua, it is very clearly seen, just as in the case of El Salvador. And I believe that there are some islands in the Caribbean, such as Dominica, St. Vincent, and even St. Kitts and Nevis. But I believe that the landmark case is Nicaragua, where the injection of Venezuelan petroleum cooperation gave Daniel Ortega a multi-million-dollar budget, over $3 billion for social aid that he used for campaign purposes. And we can clearly see that when Chavez was still alive and manipulating these oil contracts, he was doing so with a view to allowing Ortega to have enough resources with little supervision because of the arrangements that were in place to implement the contract, in order for them to have million-dollar budgets that would gain him social support. We must remember that Ortega, after finishing his presidency in the 90s, he had failed attempts to win elections, and only after getting support from Venezuela was he able to win, and it was thanks to Venezuela's support, that unscrupulous support. This is a result of investigation that we did in Nicaragua and with findings that we gathered for this project.
So it's clear that the funds, as they're being distributed, by Venezuela are not being audited, not being controlled effectively. But I think what David is suggesting that even on the other end, they're not being controlled or audited effectively either. Could you speak to, with respect to maybe Nicaragua, El Salvador, perhaps other countries, how this money was used and what it bought Venezuela in terms of diplomatic influence? What was the ultimate objective of distributing this money and distributing it in the sort of loose way that it was? What were the what benefits, perceived benefits, did it bring to the leadership of Venezuela?
Thanks. Thank you, Michael. Gracias. Sí, yo creo que este es un tema fascinante porque
No, I think this is a fascinating topic because what is the role that corruption plays after all? That's the question. Because all of this could have been done without corruption. Money could have been invested in countries. They could have, Venezuela could have sent oil to the countries. There could have been external audits and so forth. All of this could have been done without corruption. So the issue of to use oil to buy the support of neighbors is nothing new. We saw that in the 70s with the San Jose Agreement, whereby Mexico and Venezuela, with the rise of oil prices going from $4 to $15 a barrel, now that hit hard the non-oil producing countries, and so Mexico and Venezuela developed this project, this association, to help the countries of the Caribbean, the Central American countries, without their own source of energy, to overcome this situation. Now, that didn't lead to massive corruption or chaos or humanitarian crises like what we see in Venezuela. So what is the role of corruption? That's the issue. Kleptocracies, and in the case of Venezuela, corruption becomes a mechanism of power, a lever of power. This isn't something that is a non-desired result, unexpected result, or distortion of the system. It's really quite deliberate, because in the long term, corruption, in the short and the long term, corruption buys complicity, loyalty that are harder to break than loyalties and complicities that stem from shared ideology. Now we have a whole host of people who are tied to governments in Latin America, governments of the 14 countries, which are constrained from acting freely because Venezuela knows the secrets, knows the dirty deeds and of all these members of the political and economic sectors, knows the secrets of these acts of corruption. And you see this at the OAS when votes are held. How is it that there are still countries voting for Venezuela, knowing that the Venezuelan model is a complete failure, it's a mass violation of human rights? And so, just as we speak of hard power, military might, soft power, convincing, winning people over through values and principles, soft power, that is this model that was being used by Venezuela, they use the term social power, the supposed interest of Venezuela to promote the well-being of allies in the region through these types of investments, carrying out health campaigns. So social power was the facade, but beyond that, what was really propping up the whole system was the power of corruption. That's what has made it possible to create these ties that are so hard to break with all of these different players who have taken part with Venezuela, inside and outside of Venezuela. We're all a part of this mass scheme of corruption. $28 billion can't be justified from the standpoint of investment and the type of exchange that we really saw. It goes much deeper than that. So this connotation of actually creating these unbreakable ties, that's what it was all about. Now, before going to Q&A, I want to talk about journalism. This type of investigative journalism, if it weren't for that, this wouldn't have been uncovered. That's really, we wouldn't have arrived at the essence of the problem, the depths of this problem. So, how can you sum up the biggest challenges that you had to face? How do you think international cooperation could help to keep this type of investigative journalism going in Latin America?
Bueno, el mayor reto
The biggest challenge
superar la falta de transparencia
was to overcome the lack of transparency. That was the common denominator in many of the beneficiary countries. To gather all the data, to gain access to this data, which we gathered through looking at contrasts, comparing data that different organizations in Guyana, Nicaragua, and other places through public access to information laws that we were able to get a hold of. But the two most opaque countries of the region, Venezuela and Nicaragua, yes, that was a huge challenge that we had to overcome, the lack of transparency. And to cobble together this whole story, the whole account, with all this disparate information, it was very difficult. Many documents had to be reviewed. There was much information that we managed to gain through either official or unofficial means. Some documents were publicly available. In the case of Guyana, in which there were audits, the only exception of all of the beneficiaries, but these audits were carried out for political reasons, not in the spirit of transparency to see if the monies were being well spent. That was the biggest stumbling block. And also to carry out journalism from Venezuela, in the case of the Venezuelan team, and from within Nicaragua. That is very difficult. At the beginning of our investigation, there was many protests, demonstrations, and repression. And the team on the ground in the countries, some of the journalists were assaulted. And that affected our work in the subsequent weeks. Now, Nicaragua, the media was very critical of the Ortega regime, and Chamorro had to actually leave the country. She was exiled. There was fear. Yes, we always felt the fear that we wouldn't be able to continue, especially in Nicaragua, that the coordinator of the team wasn't going to be able to continue in Nicaragua, in Venezuela. In Venezuela, it's not just the issue of the harassment of the media, but in the case of El Pitazo, which is one of the digital, non-traditional media outlets working with us, there was the shutdown or the blocking of the internet and many other barriers that were erected to undermine our efforts. Now, on cooperation internationally, what could be done to facilitate this type of work? I think it's very important for there to be support from institutions. It was no easy thing for us to coordinate all these different teams. We had to walk a fine line. This type of journalism that investigates deeply into subject matters. This calls for institutional support international support from states. This may be utopia that I'm referring to, but just to have the information made available publicly, to open up access to information, that would be the best way to cooperate. Now, I would like to speak a bit about the response that you've seen. You spoke about the cases in Haiti, in Guyana, in which there was an attempt to look into what happened to the money. In the case of Haiti, there was an investigation in the Congress. In Guyana, there was a change in the local government. A different party had to come in that wasn't aligned with Venezuela. Could you give us an idea of what the current status of these ongoing investigations are? Where do we stand? In the case of Guyana, as you rightfully said, there was a change of administration, an ideological change, which made it possible for an audit to be conducted, an investigation to be launched into how the monies from Petrocaribe were being used there. In the case of Haiti, it wasn't because of a change of administration in that case, but there was a request made by the Senate to look into what had transpired. Now, yes, there were some changes in political strategy because they were allies of President Moïse, and then they stopped supporting him, and then they wanted to look into what had been done because President Moïse was a businessman who took part in some of these contracts. It wasn't that his administration handled monies from Petrocaribe. It was no longer receiving money at that point. But they looked into what was done earlier when he was a businessman. So audits were carried out. The Comptroller's Office also issued a report. But in all of these cases, where there are no consequences, legal consequences, or liability for anyone implied or allegedly involved in these illicit acts. And so, yes, reports and audits were issued, but they weren't able to take these cases to the courts to try anyone. In the case of Haiti, the Haitian Comptroller's Office issued a report. The report went to the Senate. The Senate itself fed into that report, and it all amounted to naught. Another report, a very specific one, 600 pages long, was issued, very detailed, what companies received money, under what conditions, what the status of each project was. But when it reached the full Senate, it was sent back to the Comptroller's Office. That was the decision at the Senate. Yeah, it's a great report, but let's send it back. Now the Comptroller's Office has to do another report, said the Senate. So, and to cross-check, double-check that information. And a month back was when the Haitian Comptroller's Office issued that new report, which is the one that might shed light on the situation and lead to a court case into the use of these funds. Just last week, an investigative judge was appointed who is going to be presiding over that case.
Follow up with you on the responses question. You mentioned beneficial ownership transparency as a key kind of ask that Transparency International has for the U.S. Congress in terms of making it more difficult for the profits of corruption to find their way into the banking system. Global Magnitsky is something else that comes up in this report, and actually the senator, the Dominican Senator Felix Bautista, who Suhelis mentioned, has now been sanctioned under the GLOMAG law. Can you speak a little bit to the impact of, for Zoe, although Miriam, you're welcome to jump in as well, the impact of GLOMAG, its potential as a response tool to the kinds of findings that we see in this report?
Absolutely, I will in a second. But first I want to also add to the question about what should international aid be doing and the role of independent investigations, I would really urge international aid to make a much more concerted effort to support civil society and invest in independent investigative journalism in the small island states of the English-speaking Caribbean. Not just the English-speaking Caribbean, but the Caribbean. It's a woefully sort of neglected region, but it's clearly, I mean, just looking at this report, how important is it? It's very important, not just for the people from the island states, but as part of a global community working to achieve real accountability for government. So you can't tackle Venezuela without really encouraging and supporting independent civil society voices, independent journalism in the small island states and in the English-speaking Caribbean, like Guyana. And Guyana is a perfect example of that. We started, thanks to local pressure coming from Guyana, we supported the development of independent civil society there, tackling corruption and really pushing corruption in a much more constructive way to the top of the national agenda. We have national leadership there that's changed, and so as a result, Guyana's actually moving up in the positive direction on our annual corruption perceptions index. It's made major strides. None of that would happen without strong reporting and strong civil society. But it's sort of, a one-off. So until our DC community and the international aid community really start to support, more powerful presence in support for independent voices in the Caribbean, I think we're going to be, we're going to not be as well empowered to tackle these issues as we could be. As for GLOMAG, it is absolutely an essential instrument for fighting corruption worldwide. Yes, many of the kleptocrats in Venezuela have been put on the sanctions list. This is an incredibly useful tool because it targets individuals and it makes it less likely, or its major intent is to create behavior change and make it, less likely that corrupt actors are going to want to sort of play the game because they know they're going to be targeted individually. So GLOMAG is a law that should be supported. We need to give much more resources to the folks in the Department of Justice and the Office of Financial Asset Control to be able to do the independent investigations, but we certainly welcome the capacity to, as civil society, bring information to the US government that they might not have, which we do, and it's making a huge difference. So I think as a legal instrument, there's things that could be strengthened. Sometimes it's used politically by the White House in ways that maybe we would, object to, but as an instrument, it's just such a powerful tool and has really been a game changer for our work.
Miriam, ¿quieres agregar algo sobre este tema?
Miriam, would you like to add something about this? The Western world is coming to grips with this issue of kleptocracies and the use that kleptocrats make of international financial systems and the facilities.
¿Aló? Okay. Entonces, digamos, este es un reto muy grande
available to them. So yes, this is a challenge for Western democracies to find the appropriate mechanisms, the suitable mechanisms to tackle this phenomenon. It's really difficult to staunch it, to halt it, given how easy it is for corrupt people to carry out these acts. There have to be mechanisms, sanctions, to curtail these corrupt practices. Civil society has to be galvanized and throw their support behind investigative reporting, such as this report, from different approaches, different angles, so that we can tackle such a complex phenomenon, so that all of these different actors All of these different mechanisms can play a critical role. Clearly, we need to bring to bear greater imagination, do more investigative journalism, but this is one of the biggest challenges that Western democracies face right now, to deal with such a complex phenomenon. I'll be brief. We have to have this conviction in journalism that corruption is something that has become transnational, and therefore we have to rise to become ourselves transnational. Journalists have to be transnational, how we cover these acts of corruption, track the money, to disinter, to reveal where the money originates from, where it's hidden, ultimately, because these countries and those involved in corruption naturally don't want there to be much transparency. So thank you very much, everyone. Now we're going to give the floor to people in the audience for questions. How were journalists able to do this, for example? It wasn't overnight that you found a group of specialized, skilled people who could do this. For there to be investigative journalism, you have to have the right journalists capable of doing it. Questions?
Let's take three questions, and then we'll come back to our speakers. Please just introduce yourself and keep your questions brief.
Sí, buenos días. Alejandro Sánchez de James Defense. Mi pregunta es acerca de El
Good morning.
Salvador.
I would like to ask about El Salvador. The president-elect, Bukele, was just in Washington last week, and he promised that El Salvador was going to stop supporting Daniel Ortega in Nicaragua and Maduro in Venezuela. So what do we know about the assistance Venezuela gave to El Salvador through the Petrocaribe system? And the FLMN political party, is that being looked into?
Please introduce yourself, please.
Bueno, yo hablo bastante fuerte, pero yo me llamo Carmen Iribarren, soy venezolana.
I'm from Venezuela.
Quisiera que hablen un poco sobre el aparato de espionaje.
Tell us about the apparatus of spying carried out by Fidel Castro's henchmen from Cuba and Venezuela, and how this is used in a devastating way in Venezuela to control the military in Venezuela, as well as many other people in civil society, and so on and so on. This is something new in Venezuela. It did not exist before Chavez's time. The Cuban issue is something we'll come back to. It's something we're going to take up.
Sure.
Buenos días, Franklin Morales de la Embajada de Panamá.
From the Embassy of Panama, Franklin Morales. Now, to carry out this analysis of all the countries involved, have you identified which actors within countries have been complicit in this type of corruption, making it possible? Are we talking about certain politicians? Is it private enterprise? Who has been involved in this? If you could give us more details.
Quizás podemos comenzar con
Suhelis, perhaps you could start. You can answer whatever questions you're interested in answering, and then we'll give the floor to other panelists. Let's start with the last question first. We've been speaking in generic terms about each case, but yes, there have been actors identified individually in each one of the countries, especially in Nicaragua, El Salvador, Haiti, the Dominican Republic, given the symbiosis that exists between them and some islands of the Caribbean, Guyana, how this mechanism works and who benefited from it, mostly people close to the circles of power, politicians. The pattern that we identified is the symbiosis between political actors, civil servants, In the case of Nicaragua,
que comenzó a través de concejales,
these were city councilmen,
de alcaldes de
mayors rather, of Nicaragua,
fueron los que
where
dieron
this
como el
started.
piso político para el
They were the
regreso
ones
de Ortega. Y así
that
fue como
laid
comenzó
the groundwork for Ortega's return.
recuperación de Petrocaribe en Venezuela.
And now,
Fue a través de, ni siquiera fue de gobierno.
the support,
En Nicaragua fue
in the case of
de
Nicaragua, from Venezuela was through local governments.
una red
And they created a network
de gente que se benefició de
of people who
que se
benefited
beneficiaron de la ayuda.
from this assistance.
Y ese mismo patrón de políticos,
Now, the same pattern
funcionarios,
of
ministros, poderes
civil servants, of politicians, ministers,
financieros que ejecutaban la ayuda,
the ones who headed up the financial institutions that actually implemented projects that received the money.
cada uno de esos gobiernos. Sí, hay como unos núcleos
There are some
bien típicos en
typical
temas de corrupción
players, the core of the government,
o quizás no, pero que se beneficiaron de lo. Pero sí
workers who benefited from this.
personas,
But yes, we have pinpointed individuals. Do you want to speak of El Salvador?
Conectando todos los puntos, ¿no? Por ejemplo,
Connecting all of the dots.
en El Salvador,
In the case of El Salvador,
el gran operador de la ayuda es
the big operator
dirigente del partido de gobierno que se llama
is a ruling party bigwig, the one behind the throne of that controls the support coming from Venezuela. And in prior investigations, he seemed to be at the center of a host of companies that these are facade companies that were a part of this. Now, in the case of Nicaragua, something else that's very important is to see how the treasurer of the ruling party, Francisco Lopez, the role he played. He was one of the bigwigs working with the Venezuelans that created all these mechanisms through which the assistance was channeled. Now, he's been investigated for money laundering, and Chico Lopez, that was Marino. In Chico Lopez's case, he has been sanctioned. So, in each case, in some cases we were able to go deeper. In others, we weren't able to go so deep because this is an ongoing investigation. But without a doubt, there are these big players, and then you have the small businesses that are tied to this this activity. Now, there's a petroleum company in El Salvador that's also involved in this. This that played an advisory role. The person handling the funds, that is more than $1 billion, was channeled through the Alba Petróleo of El Salvador company. These are loans from banks in some cases. According to evidence that we've gathered, that all revolves around Luis Merino, Jose Luis Merino. This was a diplomatic mechanism in El Salvador that linked up with Venezuela. Now, the new president has promised, regarding what he has promised, as a journalist, I can say from what a politician promises and what he actually carries out are two different things. Let's wait and see. Now, the Cuban connection. Let's talk about the Cuban connection. Cuba played a very important role in all of this. We know that Cuba was a country that was behind many of Venezuela's policies.
Miriam?
Muchas gracias, Carmen, por esa pregunta.
Thank you very much, Carmen, for your question. Actually, the case of Cuba is very important, and you might have found funny the fact that Cuba is not part of the Petro-Caribbean scheme, given that it is a Caribbean country, but we treat Cuba differently. As early as the year 2000, Venezuela and Cuba signed comprehensive Cuba-Venezuela cooperation agreement. This comprehensive agreement includes the granting or sale to Cuba of 100,000 barrels of oil a day in exchange for a set of services, basically doctors, sports coaches, and then gradually that agreement started expanding and broadening more and more to get all the way up to espionage or intelligence work, know-how gathering regarding repression, the presence of Cubans in Venezuela's ministries or notary offices, or just different areas that have to do with social control. That is to say, the doctors were placed in in low-income neighborhoods through the low-income neighborhood program. The same with sports coaches, and I'm sure you read the article on the New York Times a few days ago where the Cuban physicians in Venezuela were describing in detail how their mission was political in nature, and providing medical care was dependent upon patients' political affiliation. So this comprehensive cooperation agreement, which is the broadest, the more complex, and most extensive in its kind, continues to be key, even to this day, when Venezuela is producing a third of the oil that it used to produce when Chavez came to power, from 3.3 million barrels a day. Now it's barely getting to a million, even less during the blackout. So in spite of that, we estimate that Venezuela continues to send to Cuba maybe not 100,000 barrels a day, but maybe close to 50,000 barrels a day. Not too long ago, when Cuba was hit by a hurricane, in the midst of Venezuela's humanitarian crisis, Venezuela sent humanitarian aid and water and food supplies to Cuba, something that Venezuelans themselves lack. So that is a very, very close relationship that covers all kinds of areas. And what Carmen said, regarding espionage, well, it's had a huge impact in the control of the armed forces and the security apparatus, and it's one of the key aspects that keep some of Maduro's supporting sectors still associated with the government. It's very closely related. What you're saying is that this type of investigation shows that this type of investigation needs to cover a lot more. We have talked about Cuba, we have talked about Panama and the ties to politics in Panama, but that was not one of the original countries. So I believe there's still a lot to do. What do you think? Yes, well, we need to continue working and organizing teams. I think the Cuban aspect is a big opportunity for investigative journalism. We've done some from Venezuela focusing on Cuba with important revelations, especially the issue of ID management and all that, because everything ends up in some sort of subsidy. So contracts to issue the national ID cards that are maybe $100 million. Well, Cubans are paid 4 times that amount. So there's a lot more material to continue working, and also continue working in the English-speaking countries of the Caribbean, because there's a lot to do, and I think we need to gather more information. Yeah, because the Caribbean is going along those lines. That's a good question. I don't know if Carlos would like to say something about that, but in Conecta's agenda, definitely the Caribbean is present, and in a few days we will continue working. So the international cooperation agencies should take note of that, right?
Time for another round of questions.
Yeah, just to quickly add, so I've spent a lot of time working with civil society in small island states tackling issues of corruption. One thing that's always emerged is how difficult it is to have local independent investigative journalism. Small island states are very challenging places to speak truth to power. And so the fact that you can create a network that is transnational, that can support local voices is really critical. And I just really want to commend Connect Us for that aim.
Thank you. So, gracias. Creo que, Michael, tenemos tiempo para una.
Well, is there time for like one more round of questions?
So Pedro Almendia from the Inter-American Dialogue. My question is related to the loans that Venezuela has extended to the Caribbean nations, and to the extent, do you know to what extent those loans have been paid back and how much the islands owe to Venezuela so far?
Hola, mi nombre es Sasha Chafkin.
Hi, I'm Sasha Chafkin, and my question is whether you found any kind of ties between Petro-Caribbean and Odebrecht. For example, whether there were public works that were funded by Petrocaribe, where the contracts were awarded to Odebrecht, or politicians that got money from Odebrecht and Petro-Caribbean.
Great questions. Anyone else?
Sort of a long way. Yeah, my name is Marcos Wilson. I'm from Panama, and I'm most interested in some observations, if you may, about countries in the region, Latin America, mainly are we talk of governments, but when we go and we focus on each government, there's a superstructure that is financial, and people refer to as the elites, but they're basically financial elites. So I'm most interested in the connection between the financial elites in the region, because that's where the real power is. Those are the relationships that don't seem to be susceptible to political pressure from outside. Those are mainly business elites, and those are the people that actually speak to each other and make things happen. So I'm just interested in, I have no idea how to go about finding out that, but any insights into that area would be interesting to listen to.
So
there's Zoe. I mean, especially when we think about things like GLOMAG, are we seeing evidence that we're getting after the financial networks of these corrupt sort of kingpins, or is it just the sort of the face at the top that's being sanctioned?
Sure. My first reaction to that, and it's a reaction, it's a great question, is if we weren't getting to so many of these financial elites, while they're working so hard to lobby the U.S. government to get off sanctions list, to get rid of CSIG. I mean, we've seen the impact of lobbying here for the interests of kleptocrats around the world, and that's definitely the case for the financial elite who are in cahoots with, say, the Guatemala government and many other governments. So yes, and then the GLOMAG is so powerful. Why were the Russians meeting with the Trump campaign? Everyone knows it was to try to get rid of GLOMAG. Yes, this is absolutely targeting. In some countries, you go into the private sector and you take control of the government. In other countries, the government gives you control over the private sector. But there's always going to be elites. And one thing about Venezuela is, being anti-establishment doesn't really get you anywhere, because you have establishment of all forms. And the collusion between the super wealthy in government, while it has different manifestations in different forms, is definitely real, and it's definitely being targeted by many of our sanctions. So yes, I do think that there's a great level of discomfort. Otherwise, you wouldn't see the kind of lobbying you do here these days.
Perfect. Thanks, Zoe. David.
Now, regarding the debts, well, basically, the list of beneficiary countries listed two that have million-dollar amounts that negotiated repayment terms, which were Jamaica and the Dominican Republic. So in general, there are $28 billion that are injected, and out of those, about $14 billion turned into long-term debt. And out of those, about 50% were held by Jamaica and the Dominican Republic. So they repaid under very favorable terms because of oil that Venezuela was able to sell and collect in full. They pay about half of what they had received, and altogether it's about $5-6 billion in payments from the Dominican Republic and Jamaica. And then we had Haiti and Nicaragua. And in each case, there are some specific amounts that, we can see how they break down. But the case of the English-speaking Caribbean, some of which have very small populations and very small territories, they still owe like $30 million or $50 million, which doesn't sound like a lot, but these are extremely large amounts in the context of their reality, the negotiations, and how the policy from Venezuela affected them. But regarding the status of each debt, that's included in our work, and it wasn't all that easy to find the official information that describing the status of each one of their debts. That's part of the lack of transparency mechanism. And regarding Odebrecht, we did not find systemic ties to that, but it's interesting. I have to say that it doesn't appear in our work. However, one of the things that we can analyze further are infrastructure providers, because these are million-dollar amounts that are allocated to infrastructure projects in the region, and you can follow up on their progress. The main project is the one in Haiti for rebuilding, and there were a lot of irregularities. Other infrastructure projects associated to Petrocaribe is the build of a refinery that's called Bolivar's Utmost Gold, which is located in Nicaragua. It was never completed, although $5 billion were originally committed. So only a fuel storage plant was finished or completed. So these are two major things. But Dominica, they had like housing projects, they've built airports and power plants with very, very little oversight. But Odebrecht is an aspect that we could inquire further on. Just to supplement regarding Odebrecht, although we don't have evidence that contractors have had direct ties, we were like 2 degrees of separation away from one of the contractors in Haiti, which is and that's a Dominican businessman. His last name is Breo Gonzalez, who owns a company that's registered in Panama, which was investigated at some point because of like obscure donations to Martinelli's family members who were tied to the Odebrecht case. And that's why I'm saying it's 2 degrees of separation. So we were not able to truly pinpoint a direct relationship. But at least the structures that were used show a lot of common ground. That is to say, they are similar schemes. That is to say, all the offshore accounts and all that. Or was it completely different? I'm talking about between Otterbreak and what you did here and the structure, the scheme that was used. Microphone, please. We can't hear you. Well, as far as we know, it could be similar, a similar model, a similar scheme, but we need to inquire further. In the case of El Salvador, we have a landmark case because of how much information the local journalists and the journalists that were part of the team were able to gather. I have some comments. One that has to do with the issue of businessmen. A very interesting question, by the way. We have talked many times about Nicaragua. Well, it is very clear that the business sector in Nicaragua, which started at the beginning of Daniel Ortega's second mandate, had very tense relationships with Ortega's governments. However, very quickly it got to an agreement in support and became one of the most important partners of the Nicaraguan government. Basically, thanks to the economic bounty that the Nicaraguan businesses enjoyed due to export of cattle, like we said, black beans, coffee. They reached export levels that they had not seen in over 20 years at preferential rates also, because they mailed very low quality coffee, or part of what they sent to Venezuela was very low quality coffee, but with premium prices, like very high quality coffee price. So that gave them unconditional support to Ortega's administration until last year because of this economic bounty. We also heard about Dominica. I find Dominica's case very interesting. It has 77,000 people and it received $54 million. But Dominica is a loyal ally to Venezuela. Even to this day, that relationship has not, those ties have not been broken. And we have to think about how cheap it was for Venezuela's government to buy Dominica as an ally. And in terms of OAS's votes, Dominica's vote is just as important as Brazil's, which has 200 million people. So Venezuela's investment in the Caribbean was very targeted at buying that support based on something that at some point was considered relatively cheap, especially in terms of the number of oil barrels, but that in the long run contributed to the country's devastation. And finally, I don't think, I would like to say that Otterbreck and Petro Caribbean is not the same. Otterbreck has, I'm not a specialist, I don't claim to be a specialist, but Otterbreck has an economic interest, I should say, to attract investments. And the majority of the bribes that were paid had to do with renegotiating bidding contracts, and then when they are renegotiated, well, Odebrecht's investment portfolio broadens, but it has nothing to do both in magnitude or overarching nature of Venezuela's operation that covers, you know, this barter of oil for food, votes at the OAS. It's different. It's a very different operation. Although there is some common ground, of course, in terms of, you know, corruption, payment of bribes, offshore accounts, etc. But the magnitude of what we're talking about here is phenomenal. And figures speaks for themselves. What Carlos Eduardo showed at the beginning shows, well, Otterbreck, through all this scheme, achieved like $3.2 billion. $3.2 billion in earnings. But here we're talking about operations of around $28 billion that resulted in huge losses for Venezuela. Like I said, there can be some common ground on some aspects, but the whole concept, the magnitude, and the scope of the operations is completely different. However, I think it's interesting to mention this. The Odebrecht scandal has resulted in commotion in the region. It resulted in former presidents being jailed, other high-profile figures being jailed. However, on the other hand, Petro-Caribbean has resulted nothing. I mean, some sanctions, but that's pretty much it. But when we take into account the magnitude of the operation, it has not been met by the same kind of repercussion in terms of sanctions and change of mindset and changes, especially because of the magnitude this scandal has. This is also very closely linked to the Caribbean as a cheap ally. And we, as journalists, have analyzed the state of independence of civil society organizations in the Caribbean, and the findings are truly depressing. So there are disinformation pockets throughout the Caribbean, which totally undermines the work of the civil society is due. And there's huge repression also against the dissident, the quote-unquote dissidents and media outlets that are part of the opposition. Just to underscore the fact that Venezuela paid very little for their loyalty in the Caribbean. The Caribbean's reality is pretty unique, and the Petrocaribe's highest point was when the oil was over $100 a barrel, and that was for oil exporting countries, which impacted all countries, but even more so the Caribbean, not only because they are low-income countries, because they are very small economies, but also because they're highly dependent on hydrocarbons to produce their energy mostly, and for their cars and everything. But for example, water resources, which is the cheapest ways of producing energy, is not even a reality in the Caribbean. Power is generated through carbon or hydrocarbons, which has a high cost. And that is why we have this unconditional support that has remained and will probably in some cases remain for many years. In some cases, because, for example, the Dominican Republic and Haiti no longer have a political support for the time being. In Suhail's fieldwork, she was able to interview some public officials that asked to remain anonymous, and basically she said, okay, well, but your minister is not the same as before. He has ended his term, and the reality of the Petro-Caribbean Agreement is different, so why are you still aligned with Venezuela? And this official's response was along the lines of what you said. He said that they made the best of it while they could. They were very thankful and they were very sorry for Venezuela's reality, that was the cost they had to pay. But at the end of the day, they also had some needs at some time, and they took advantage of the situation.
I also have something to do there. There was one more question in the back. Let's take that, and then we'll come back to our panelists for a response and final comments.
First of all, thank you, Michael, for always having this wonderful conversations on behalf of Visión Democrática, Venezuelan small think tank that we talk about democracy and how to spread the influence of the Venezuelan diaspora. We really appreciate all the help and all the significant work that you guys do. I have one quick question to anybody in the panel who could answer it. In the past couple days, especially after January 23rd, we've seen the usurper of the Department of State of Venezuela go into the Caribbean islands to start to forgive debt. Could that debt that's been forgiven illegally in some way or form be cashed by the legitimate president Juan Guaidó in the future? Or is there some international law being in play here?
Who wants to take that on? You stumped our panel, Rafa. Zoe?
Habría que estudiar eso.
Well, we would have to analyze the situation and get a better understanding before we can answer. But we need to understand that Nicolás Maduro's petrodiplomacy in the Caribbean remains active, and to the extent that it is active, some things will still exist. We achieved a declaration from high officials that were visiting some island, and the prime minister from the island was interviewed, and the typical conversation went like this: okay, we're very thankful for the bravery that your country has shown during your votes at the OAS and other international fora. And the prime minister's response was, well, and we are thankful for the interest you have in helping us with funding social projects, etc. That's usually how the conversation goes. Or when the Venezuelan Foreign Ministry or the president goes, or when ambassador runs into the prime minister, that's a typical conversation that takes place. Now, officially, they deny the fact that they are receiving pressure, that in the Caribbean diplomats say, we don't see oppression, the debt play no role. But when you look at the exchange between them, that's how it goes.
As the report itself alludes to, the central kind of motivating, driving factor in Petrocaribe really was this political agenda and securing diplomatic support for good times and now for difficult times for the Maduro regime. And so it would be consistent with that mission to now take the debt that's been accumulated by recipient countries and forgive it if that's what it takes to maintain that political support, even if it comes at great expense to the national treasury and ultimately to the Venezuelan people. I think with that, we should call it a day. This has been an incredibly enriching discussion based on a truly really impressive piece of work. Just want to commend again Conectas and especially David and Zuhedis and Miriam for Ned's support for this project, and then Luis, pleasure to do this with you. Zoe, wonderful to have you as always, and grateful for everything that TI does in Venezuela and throughout the region. Thank you all for being here. I want to acknowledge my colleague Tamar Ziff for her role in conceiving and organizing this panel, and Elizabeth as well. And just please help me thank our panelists for being here and for their terrific contributions.